everybody, Zach again, NinjaTorah.com, coming in, making a video for you today. We're going to continue on with our Enoch series and move on over into the objections that were levied by 119 Ministries. Now, 119 Ministries is a ministry that I have supported for a long time. I often refer people to their website, to their content. I love their fellowship finder map that they have online. Great for people who are looking for fellowship in their area who may not have it. So they have a lot of great resources at that website, and I always refer people to it for so many reasons. But when they came out with this video on Enoch, I was just flabbergasted. Number one, because I've known John Sherman for a while. I used to fellowship with his family back when we lived in the St. Louis area, and I always thought he felt pretty highly about this book. And then John informed me after I emailed him that he had kind of changed his position over the years. Okay, that's fine. We change. People change. But I emailed him. I said, what you put out here was absolutely ridiculous. And on the strongest terms, I said, what you've put out is wrong. And he said, wow, you've never actually emailed me for anything you felt strongly about, that we've put out before. I said, yeah, because most of what you put out, I agree with. There's little things here and there. Everyone has little things, right? But this was huge. I was like, no way. This is just, I could not believe some of the arguments that they levied against this book, how ridiculous they were. And so we'll go through that today, and I'll show you why. And, I agree with most of the content they put out. They have really good content, and they have a very scholarly approach most of the time. And that's why I refer people there. So let's begin with their arguments. I basically condensed their hour-long video down into 6 main arguments that they have, and we'll go through each one of them. And the first one is this: anachronisms. Anachronisms exist in the book of Enoch, and they give the example of Mount Sinai. Okay, so what's the definition of an anachronism? An anachronism is something that is out of order chronologically, something time-wise, chronologically out of order. Here is an example, this picture right here. This is a picture of World War I or World War II soldiers, and one is drinking a Diet Coke, the other one is on his cell phone, the other one is on listening to earbuds. There's a stuffed animal of Bob the Builder, and it's just, this is chronologically incorrect. Chronologically incorrect. That is an example of an anachronism. So let's take a look at their example of Mount Sinai. Is there anything in the Bible that says you can't know that Mount Sinai existed before the flood? We know Mount Sinai is first identified at the time of Moses. Why? Is there anything in the Bible that says Enoch could not have known where Mount Sinai was? We know for a fact that Mount Hermon was identified in the New Testament. It doesn't say it specifically, but it's obvious. Everyone then at that time believed that that was actually the Mount Hermon. The same Mount Hermon that's listed in the book of Enoch. Is there anything in our Bible that says you can't know where something was before and after flood? No. It doesn't say that. It says the earth was destroyed, but that doesn't mean that you can't identify locations. It never says that. So that's not the same thing. I don't believe this is an anachronism. And to identify Enoch, in Enoch, where Mount Sinai was, or there was a Mount Sinai, to me is not an anachronism. And what even blew me away more than listing this as an anachronism was you were using the argument of an anachronism to begin with, because this is like the number one argument the atheists use to attack the Bible. Anachronisms. And they're all easily explained, just like they are explained in the book of Enoch. Let me give you some examples. These are hard-hitting anachronisms, supposedly, that the atheists used to discredit the Bible. Now, let's go back to our picture of these World War I, World War II soldiers now. Now, it's black and white. It's an anachronism. Now, you flip it, and now you know the story of it being a bunch of reenactors. Okay, they're on their break. These are people who are telling a story about a past event. So now what you see before as an anachronism is actually not an anachronism. These are reenactors. They're telling a story, and they're telling a story to a modern day audience. That makes sense, and that makes this picture no longer an anachronism. Let me give you some examples. Number one, this is one of the big ones that atheists use. In Genesis 11 and Genesis 15, it's very clear that Abraham comes out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, of the Chaldees. Yet the city of Ur was in southern Mesopotamia, and the Chaldeans did not occupy the region until about 1000 BC. That time frame is long after the time of Abraham, and atheists will use this right here. See, that's an anachronism. No, it's because this existed probably for a long time in oral tradition, and eventually by the time it was written down and canonized, someone was telling the story to a more modern audience who knew the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. And so that's why you say land of Ur of the Chaldeans, even though it existed long after Abraham existed. I'll give you another fantastic example. Genesis 14:14. And when Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants that were born in his house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. Wait a minute, Dan? That's like his great-grandchild. How did the land of Dan exist at the time of Abraham? That's Jacob's son, where the tribe of Dan, long after that, settled in northern Israel and became known as the land of Dan. How did Abraham go there? And why did they call it the land of Dan back then? Well, they didn't. What you have, again, is oral tradition that existed and was passed down and then eventually retold to a more modern audience who would understand the land because that's the world they live in. They know the land of Dan. It's that simple. This is oral tradition. This is direct evidence of oral tradition. This is not an anachronism. But atheists will use these arguments over and over again to tell you that the Bible is mythical, it's made up, it's a bunch of lies, it's a nice story and all, but it's got all kinds of historical inaccuracies. You can't trust it at all. And 119, you picked up the same gun that the atheists used, and now you're shooting bullets out of it at Enoch. I couldn't believe when I saw this video that this was the argument you were making. I was beside myself. I'm like, surely they understand this. Okay, I'll give you a New Testament example. In Luke 10:35, you have the Good Samaritan who drops off 2 pence to the innkeeper. 2 pence, wait a minute, that's a British denomination of money. We're talking about 2,000 years ago. The United Kingdom didn't exist at the time. That's an anachronism. Because if you don't know nothing from nobody, you don't understand there's a Greek and Latin manuscript that actually translates that into a Greek denarii for a Roman denarius, which is what I'm holding right here. This is a 2,000, well, it's about 1,800 years old. 1,800-year-old Roman denarius. It's the same size as the British pence, basically. Roughly the same silver content as the British pence. And so if you're a translator trying to convey a story to a more modern day audience, you're letting them know, hey, listen, he gave 2 pence, 2 denarius worth. The pence is the right translation. That's all you're seeing throughout the rest of your Bible. That's all you're seeing throughout the book of Enoch. You're seeing a story being told with modern day translators, more modern day translators than from when the story first originally was told, so that the modern day audience understands the story you're trying to tell. That's all you're seeing. And again, this is something that the atheists used over and over again to try to discredit the Bible. And now we're being seen here being used to try to discredit Enoch. And anachronisms, that's what you got. That's what you're using. Starts off good, but when you actually examine it, not so good.
I've done this before. He does not know what to expect. He's in the air. He's in good shape. Very good.
Next.
All right, objection number 2. The book of Enoch isn't that old, and the example they give are the Greek influences that they find throughout the text. In the video, 119 tells us that scholars can date this book based on the Greek content that they find within it. And again, my response is, so what? We know that this existed in oral tradition. The oldest copy fragments that we have are 2nd century BC, along with all the other old books, copy fragments that we find in the Bible with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is a Greek world. And so when you're writing something down, just like you have with the anachronisms, you're writing it down for the audience that you're trying to tell the story to. And the people who are writing things down, people who are telling the story, the people who are bringing things out of oral tradition at about the time of Ezra the scribe and Ptolemy II, when so much information was being put from pen to paper, it's a Greek world. You're going to have Greek influences in the text because the people who are writing it down, who are disseminating the information, are Greek. Greece has conquered everything at this point, almost. So it's like, yeah, there's Greek influence in the text. So what? I look back at the Iliad, and the Iliad, there are people who look at that, the scholars, and they say, oh, there's anachronisms in here because at the time the Iliad was originally starting to disseminate through oral tradition about 1250 BC or so, thereabouts. At the time, for 500 years, it moved through oral tradition and finally was canonized. But by the time it was canonized, the scholars today will go back to the Iliad and say, hey, there's anachronisms in here because we have Greek references and grammar that didn't exist at an earlier point when we know the Iliad was first composed by Homer. So how do you explain that? It's because it was passed down through oral tradition. It was passed down through different audiences, and it picked up different grammar and influences that didn't exist at the time it was first composed. I'll give you an example. No one listening to the sound of my voice right now, their parents, when they were children, had cell phones. Everyone today knows what a cell phone is. But just one generation ago, when that generation were children, they had no idea what a cell phone was. You see how things can quickly change? And so that's how things like this can enter into the text. Again, dumb argument. I could not. So what? It's got Greek influence in it. It's because it's a Greek world. It's as simple as that. Next argument. All right, objection number 3. The only complete copy of Enoch we have is in the Ge'ez language. That's not true actually at all. So this is one of the things. I'm surprised you weren't more honest with your audience and even mentioned the fact that there's a complete Aramaic copy out there that's been photographed, documented, and witnessed. It's not open to the public yet. Okay, but people know it's out there. We know it exists. And it includes the parables of Enoch, the section that talks most about the Messiah. It's all in there. It's out there. So a couple of points I want to make. We know that copy fragments in Aramaic have been found in almost every cave of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a lot. And then also, scholars date Enoch copy fragments as the same age as the oldest fragments of Genesis, Daniel, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. So to go out there and tell people that we only have one copy, and that's in the Ge'ez language, that's blatantly dishonest. Again, I was so surprised you put this out. It's like you were hiding things from your audience in order to get them to believe a certain way. And this is not like you. This is not what your ministry has done in the past. You usually are open with all the arguments and all the evidence, and you make people decide. But this was so one-sided. I was like, all right, next objection. Moving on to objection number 4. We should not assume that the Enoch we have today is a 100% accurate representation of the version that they had in the first century. Again, I was really surprised 119 was not being openly honest with its audience by mentioning the fact that there were early church fathers who believed that this book was legitimate. You never brought that information out. You should have at least shared that information. A couple of points. The Ge'ez version matches up with the fragments that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, those fragments were found in almost every cave. Point number 2, the early church fathers had copies, and their commentary seems to match up with the Ge'ez and fragment copies. Folks, that's 3 witnesses, of consistency. You have what we found in the fragment copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and matches up with the Ge'ez version, and then you have the commentary written by the early church fathers that matches up with both of those. That's 3 witnesses. So it's a bad argument to say that you don't have an 100% accurate representation of what they had back then, because there's nothing that goes contrary that would give evidence otherwise that it's not accurate. Ugh. All right, next argument. Objection number 5. There are very few copies of Enoch, unlike the manuscripts that we have of other biblical books. That's right, folks. We have mountains upon mountains of manuscripts for the New Testament, but Enoch, we only have a few little manuscripts and, some copy fragments. That's it. You see, one is important and one is not, don't you see? That's what they're trying to tell you. We have mountains upon mountains of manuscripts because in the New Testament, that's important. Nobody thought Enoch was important. They barely even copied it. That tells you that one is good, one is bad. Or there could be another reason. We already talked about how the Jews did not like this. It's Isaiah 53, right? Anything you can remotely connect to Yeshua, they don't like it. Push it aside. Tertullian writes about this specifically. This other scholar, Daniel Boyarin, he says the same thing. And then you have the Christians on the other side who are like, we don't like all the angels and women talk. And by the time of Council of Laodicea in 336 AD, it falls out of favor and is basically deemed heretical. That's in 336 AD. A few decades later, you've got this guy who comes on the scene, Priscillian, and what happens to him? Off with his head. Why? One of the main charges levied against him by church authorities is that he was teaching from non-canonized material. Non-canonized books. And this scholar, Henry Heyman, says it's possible that one of those books was in fact the Book of Enoch. He can't be for sure, no one can be for sure, but he speculates that it's possible. So the bottom line in all this is when the church tells you to get rid of a book, you get rid of the book. We have more modern examples like John Huss and William Tyndale, both burned at the stake because they were in possession of what church authorities called heretical books, translated books in languages outside of Latin, and they were burned at the stake. You make examples of people who you don't want them to continue the practices they're doing. And so, yeah, there's a reason why we don't have lots of copies, mountains upon mountains of copies of the Book of Enoch today, is because when the church said no more, there was no more. And think of it this way. You have a scribe who gets paid for his time. Most of the population is illiterate. He gets paid for his job of copying text work, and it takes a while to do. It's not an easy job. You have to be meticulous and careful about your copy work. When you're copying scroll from scroll, a scribe has to be careful. And, he's worth his wage. He gets paid for his job. No scribe is going to take the job for, number one, you won't get paid for, and number two, you might get burned at the stake or lose your head. People tend to like their heads attached to their shoulders, usually. And so what scribe is going to take that job on? It's not like everyone can read and write and they can make their own copies of Enoch. No, you had to go to someone who had that skill, and they're not about to take on the job if it means, ending up like old Priscillian here. It's not going to work. So the fact that you made the argument, oh, well, one's important, one's not, because of the amount of manuscripts we have versus what we don't have for Enoch. Bad argument. Bad. All right. The sixth and final objection that I'll list here from the 119 video was this one. The Essenes held to a different calendar, thus, this delegitimizes the Book of Enoch. So you're saying that because they held to a different calendar that we really don't know all that much about, the book is illegitimate. You can't count this book because there's a calendar listed in there, sort of, and you have people who interpret that calendar and it's not correct, so the book is illegitimate. My personal opinion on this, and this is just my personal opinion, okay? And I mean, I'm going to disagree with their point, but here's just my personal opinion. My personal opinion is this. It's my personal belief that what was described in Enoch was how the calendar was originally supposed to work. The problem is interpretation of that calendar. People today keep many versions of the Enoch calendar. I have friends who keep the Enoch calendar over here, and they keep it one way. I have friends who keep the Enoch calendar over there, and they keep it a different way, and they don't match up. So it's about interpretation. And not only that, let me make the second point, is that the earth is not the same as it was pre-flood. I believe that the earth was probably straight up and down, and now we're at 23-degree axis that prevents us from keeping a calendar the way it says in Enoch. I don't think that all things are not equal as it was back then. My third point is, who cares? The Jewish calendar today was invented almost 1,000 years ago. So, I mean, we have the Hillel 2 calendar today, and that's not what they kept back during the time of Yeshua. Calendars change. I don't see this as really a valid argument anyway. So what that there's a calendar listed in Enoch? I think having issues with interpretation is the main problem. I mean, there are people who use verses in Enoch to prove that the earth is flat, and I don't agree with that either. In fact, I think the exact opposite, that it proves that it's not, it's round. But it's all about interpretation. There are some people who are going to look at Scripture and they're going to interpret it one way. There's some people who are going to look at Scripture and they're going to interpret it a completely 180-degree different way. So I don't think using this as a way to say, hey, listen, they have a calendar and it's wrong, and thus the book is illegitimate. You can get rid of it. The other point that I want to make in this is that, again, you're saying that it's just those crazy Essenes living down in the caves who held to this book. They probably wrote the book, those crazy Essenes who keep a crazy calendar. But at the same time, you have people in your ministry like Wilbur who go out and say, well, the reason it's quoted so often in the New Testament, or alluded to so often in the New Testament, is because it was popular at the time. You can't say it's just those crazy Essenes and then at the same time say, oh, it was popular at the time. In fact, let's go back to Daniel Boyarin. He says this: the similitudes of Enoch seem to have been not the product of an isolated sect, but part of a more general Jewish world of thought and writing, which is why the head blogger Julia Blum over at the Israeli Institute for Biblical Studies quotes Daniel when writing about the book of Enoch. This is an academy that has over 200 faculty on the staff. I really don't understand all of your objections to this book. They seem to start off strong when you watch your video, but when you examine them and test them, they really just don't go anywhere.
I'm free, dang it.
And I think if you're honest with yourself, you'll admit that they don't really go anywhere either. All right, we'll leave it at that. One more video to come. Stay tuned. Go home, read your Bible. Thanks.